My name is Dante Mercado. I am a professional stuntman who survived the first 90 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted and plunged the world into endless winter, my skills jumping motorcycles and crashing cars became the difference between life and death. I watched civilization collapse in frozen chaos while leading desperate survivors through a nightmare where one wrong move meant freezing to death. This is how I kept us alive when summer never came back. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dante Mercado, and I am a professional stuntman. For 15 years, I made my living doing what most people would consider insane. I jumped motorcycles over buses, crashed cars through buildings, and coordinated elaborate chase sequences for Hollywood blockbusters. Every single day, I put my life on the line to make dangerous things look effortless on screen. The golden rule in my profession was simple: prepare for everything to go wrong, because it always does. You calculate every angle, check every piece of equipment 3 times, and always have at least 2 backup plans. One mistake kills you, and there are no second takes when you are flying through the air at 60 miles per hour. I thought I understood danger. I thought I knew what it meant to face death and come out alive. But 3 months ago, everything I knew about survival was put to the ultimate test. What I'm about to tell you is the story of how those skills kept me alive when the world ended. Most people who lived through what I lived through are dead now. The ones who survived the first week are mostly gone. The ones who made it through the first month are nearly extinct. I am telling you this story because somebody needs to remember what happened and how some of us managed to stay alive when civilization collapsed in 18 days. July 14, 2024 started like any other workday. I was on set in Los Angeles, coordinating a high-speed chase sequence for an action movie. The temperature was already pushing 100 degrees at 9 in the morning, typical for summer, in Southern California. We had 6 cars, 2 motorcycles, and a semi-truck rigged with cameras and safety equipment. The scene required me to jump my modified Harley-Davidson over a moving car while it crashed through a storefront window. I had done similar stunts hundreds of times before, but this one felt different. Something in my gut told me to double-check everything twice. The Harley was my pride and joy, a machine I had built from the ground up over 3 years. She was not just a motorcycle. She was a rolling fortress. I had reinforced the frame with steel plating, upgraded the suspension to handle massive impacts, and installed custom armor around the engine and fuel tank. The bike weighed nearly twice as much as a stock Harley, but she could survive crashes that would destroy any other motorcycle. I had built her to be indestructible because in my line of work, your equipment is the only thing standing between you and death. I did not know then how prophetic that choice would prove to be. We were setting up for the 3rd take when the news broke. One of the camera operators had his phone out during the break, scrolling through social media. He started shouting for everyone to come look at what he was seeing. The whole crew gathered around his small screen, watching shaky footage of something that looked like a nuclear explosion. A massive column of ash and steam was shooting straight up into the sky, so high it disappeared into the clouds. The video was coming from Yellowstone National Park. At first, nobody really understood what we were looking at. The director made jokes about it being viral marketing for some disaster movie. The lead actor started doing his impression of a news anchor, dramatically announcing the end of the world. Everyone was laughing and making references to every volcano movie ever made. But something about the footage bothered me. I had worked on enough disaster films to know what fake explosions looked like, and this was not fake. The scale was wrong, too massive, too chaotic. Real destruction never looks as clean as movie destruction. I pulled out my own phone and started searching for more information. The official news reports were just starting to come in. Yellowstone had erupted, but not like the small eruptions that had happened before. This was what scientists called a supervolcanic eruption, something that happened maybe once every 100,000 years. The ash cloud was already 30 miles high and growing. Wind patterns were going to carry it across the entire continental United States. The reporters kept using words like unprecedented and catastrophic, but they were speaking in that calm, controlled tone that news anchors use when they do not want to cause panic. Something in my stunt coordinator instincts told me this was not a drill. When you spend your career managing dangerous situations, you develop a sixth sense for when things are about to go very wrong. I had learned to trust that feeling because it had saved my life, more times than I could count. While everyone else was joking around, I quietly walked over to my truck and filled up the gas tank at the station across the street. I checked my emergency kit in the back, making sure I had water, basic tools, and a first aid kit. These were habits I had developed over years of working in remote locations where help might be hours away. The rest of that day proceeded almost normally. We finished the stunt sequence, wrapped up filming, and everyone went home like it was any other Monday. But I kept checking my phone every few minutes, watching the news coverage expand. The ash cloud was growing faster than anyone had predicted. Satellite images showed it spreading like a gray cancer across Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas. By evening, it had reached the East Coast. That night, I stayed up late researching volcanic winters. Most people had never heard of the concept, but I remembered it from a documentary I had seen years earlier. When enough ash and debris get thrown into the upper atmosphere, they block sunlight from reaching the ground. Temperatures drop, crops fail, and if the eruption is big enough, the effects can last for years. The last time it happened on this scale was 74,000 years ago, and it nearly drove humanity extinct. I told myself I was being paranoid, that modern technology and global food distribution would prevent anything that extreme from happening again. But I could not shake the feeling that I was watching the beginning of something terrible. The next morning, I woke up to find a thin layer of gray dust on my truck windshield. The air smelled like sulfur and burnt metal. The temperature had dropped from the predicted 98 degrees to 85 degrees. Los Angeles was 800 miles from Yellowstone, but the ash was already reaching us. I turned on the news and saw that the entire Midwest was covered in what looked like gray snow. Airports were closing, highways were becoming impassable, and the National Guard was being deployed to help with evacuation efforts. That was when I made the decision that probably saved my life. Instead of driving to the movie set, I drove straight to my garage in Bakersfield. I had a workshop there where I stored my equipment and worked on vehicle modifications. It was a converted auto repair shop that I had bought 5 years earlier, with thick concrete walls, a wood-burning stove, and enough space to work on multiple vehicles. More importantly, it was stocked with tools, spare parts, and everything I needed to build or fix almost anything mechanical. I spent the next 3 days watching the world change through my garage windows. The ash kept falling, heavier each day. The temperature kept dropping, 5 degrees each morning. By July 18th, it was 68 degrees in Southern California in the middle of summer. Plants were starting to wither from the ash coating their leaves. Birds were falling out of the sky, unable to fly in the increasingly thick air. The news reports were getting more urgent, but they were still talking about temporary disruptions and recovery efforts. I knew better. I had worked in enough extreme conditions to recognize when a situation was spiraling out of control. This was not temporary. The ash cloud was still growing, still spreading, still blocking more sunlight every day. I started making serious preparations. I stripped parts from the broken-down cars in my garage, converting car batteries into backup power systems. I installed additional insulation in the walls and ceiling. I stockpiled every bit of food, water, and fuel I could find before the stores ran out. The film production officially shut down on July 21st. They called it a temporary hiatus due to weather conditions, but I could hear the fear in the producer's voice when he called to deliver the news. The entire entertainment industry was grinding to a halt as transportation became impossible, and crews could not work in the increasingly toxic air. I was officially unemployed, but that was the least of my worries. By July 25th, real snow was mixing with the volcanic ash. Snow in July in California. The temperature had dropped to 45 degrees, and weather forecasters were predicting it would keep falling. The power grid was starting to fail as everyone tried to heat their homes in the middle of what should have been the hottest month of the year. Rolling blackouts were becoming routine. Gas stations were running out of fuel as delivery trucks could not navigate the ash-covered roads. I woke up on July 30th to find ice on my garage windows. Ice. In Bakersfield. In July. The thermometer read 34 degrees and thick gray snow was falling like a blizzard. The power had gone out sometime during the night, not just in my neighborhood but across the entire city. I could see the lights were out for miles in every direction. The electrical grid simply could not handle the demand, as millions of people tried to heat their homes and businesses in conditions they were never designed for. That morning I fired up my wood-burning stove for the first time in 8 months. The irony was not lost on me that I had installed it the previous winter as a backup heating source, never imagining I would need it in the middle of summer. As I sat watching the flames and listening to the wind howl outside, I realized that everything I had known about the world was over. This was not a natural disaster we would recover from in a few weeks or months. This was the new reality, and most people were not prepared for it. The neighborhood started changing immediately. At first, people were helpful and cooperative. We shared information, checked on elderly neighbors, and pooled resources to help families with young children. But as the days passed and the situation got worse instead of better, that community spirit began to crack. People started hoarding supplies, suspicious of anyone who seemed too well prepared. Arguments broke out over trivial things like parking spaces and noise levels. The social contract that held civilization together was dissolving as fast as the ice was forming. I had advantages that most people lacked. My mechanical knowledge meant I could jury-rig heating systems, repair equipment, and keep vehicles running, when others could not. My stunt equipment included welding torches, protective gear, and various tools that were invaluable in survival situations. Most importantly, I had learned to think systematically about danger, to plan for multiple contingencies, and to stay calm under pressure. These skills had been developed to help me survive motorcycle crashes and car accidents, but they translated perfectly to surviving the collapse of civilization. The first act of serious violence I witnessed happened on August 5th. I was at a gas station trying to fill up my truck when a fight broke out between two men over who was next in line. What started as an argument quickly escalated into something ugly. One man accused the other of cutting in line, voices were raised, and suddenly there was a knife involved. The whole thing lasted maybe 30 seconds, but when it was over, one man was bleeding on the ground and the other was driving away with a tank full of gas. I helped the injured man as best I could, but there was no ambulance to call. The emergency services were overwhelmed, and most of the roads were impassable. Anyway, he died while I was trying to stop the bleeding. I had never seen someone die from violence before, despite all my years doing dangerous stunts. The randomness of it, the speed with which a normal interaction turned deadly, shook me more than any crash or explosion ever had. That night, I sat in my garage and faced the truth I had been avoiding. The world I had known was gone. The government, the economy, the social structures that made modern life possible were collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. The people who survived, the next few months would be the ones who adapted quickest to the new reality. Everyone else would become statistics, casualties of a disaster too big for any individual to comprehend. I had spent my career making dangerous things look safe, but now I had to make my garage actually safe. I started modifying it like I would modify a stunt vehicle, reinforcing weak points and adding backup systems for every critical function. I welded steel plates over the windows, installed multiple locks on the doors, and created hidden storage areas for food and fuel. I even rigged up early warning systems using car alarms and motion sensors, anything to give me advance notice if trouble was approaching. The temperature hit 20 degrees on August 12th, 20 degrees in August in Southern California. The snow was 4 feet deep and still falling. Most of the houses in my neighborhood were dark and cold, their occupants either dead or relocated to emergency shelters. But the shelters were overcrowded and undersupplied, and I heard stories of violence and disease spreading through them like wildfire. I made the decision to stay in my garage, to fortify it further, and to prepare for a long siege against the elements and against human desperation. By August 18th, I realized that this was not just a bad winter that would eventually end. The volcanic ash was still blocking sunlight, still cooling the atmosphere, still creating conditions that would last for years rather than months. This was the beginning of a new ice age, triggered by the largest volcanic eruption in human history. The old world was not coming back, and anyone who wanted to survive had to accept that fact and start planning accordingly. I had built my entire career on the principle that preparation and adaptability were the keys to surviving dangerous situations. Now I was facing the most dangerous situation in human history, and those same principles were the only things keeping me alive. I had food for maybe 2 months, fuel for heating through the winter, and enough tools and spare parts to maintain my equipment indefinitely. But I also knew that eventually, desperate people would find me, and when they did, I would have to decide whether to help them or defend myself against them. The sound of breaking glass from a house down the street told me that time was running out. People were getting desperate enough to start breaking into abandoned homes, looking for anything that might help them survive another day. It was only a matter of time before they worked their way through the neighborhood to my garage. I had always been a loner, preferring to work alone rather than depend on others. But I was starting to realize that complete isolation might not be sustainable in this new world. As I checked my supplies and equipment that night, I made mental notes about what I would need to do differently if I was going to survive not just the next few days, but the next few months. The Ice Age was just beginning, and winter was still months away. If I was going to make it through to spring, I would need to start thinking beyond just personal survival. I would need to start thinking about building something larger, something that could protect not just me but others who might be worth saving. I did not know it then, but that decision would define everything that came next. The next day would bring the first test of whether my preparations were adequate, and whether the skills that had kept me alive in Hollywood stunt work would be enough to keep me alive in the real world. The garage that I had turned into a fortress was about to become a refuge, and I was about to learn that survival is not just about staying alive yourself, but about deciding who else deserves to live, and who you are willing to die to protect. The morning of August 19th changed everything. If you survived the first 18 days of the Ice Age, you learned the most important lesson of this new world. Nobody was coming to save you. The government rescue operations had stopped, the National Guard was overwhelmed, and the emergency services that people had depended on their entire lives simply no longer existed. You were on your own, and your survival depended entirely on your ability to adapt to a reality that most people could not accept. I woke up that morning to the sound of someone trying to break into my garage. Not the main door, but one of the side windows that I had reinforced with steel plating. Whoever was out there was using something heavy, probably a crowbar or a sledgehammer, and they were not being subtle about it. They wanted in, and they did not care who knew it. I grabbed my baseball bat and moved quietly to the window, listening, to assess how many people I was dealing with. 3 voices, all male, all desperate. They were arguing about the best way to get inside, debating whether to try the roof or keep working on the window. One of them mentioned seeing smoke from my chimney the night before, which meant they knew the garage was occupied and heated. In this new world, heat meant life, and life meant resources worth taking. I realized then that my preparations had made me a target rather than just keeping me safe. I had spent years making dangerous stunts look safe, but now I had to make my garage actually safe in ways I had never imagined. The steel plating over the windows had been my first modification, but it was clearly not enough. These men were determined, and they would eventually find a way in if I did not discourage them. I needed to think like a stunt coordinator, planning multiple scenarios and backup options for each one. The smart move would have been to wait them out, to let them exhaust themselves trying to break in and then hope they moved on to easier targets. But I could not afford to have my location compromised. Word would spread that there was a warm, well-supplied hideout in the neighborhood, and soon I would be dealing with larger groups and more dangerous people. I needed to make a statement that would discourage others from trying the same thing. I fired up one of my welding torches and made enough noise to let them know I was awake and armed with something that could cause serious damage. The banging stopped immediately. I heard them discussing whether to continue or retreat, and after a few minutes of whispered argument, their footsteps moved away from my garage. But I knew they would be back, probably with more people and better tools. I had bought myself time, nothing more. That day, I began the real work of converting my garage from a workshop into a fortress. I had mechanical knowledge, tools, and materials from multiple vehicles. But I also had something more valuable: years of experience making dangerous situations manageable through careful planning and preparation. Every stunt I had ever coordinated had required thinking through what could go wrong and having solutions ready before problems occurred. Now I was coordinating the most important stunt of my life, and failure was not an option. I started by stripping useful materials from every car in my garage. Seat leather became insulation for walls and windows. Car batteries were wired together to create a backup electrical system that could power lights and small heaters. Steel panels from doors and hoods were welded over vulnerable areas. I even removed the bulletproof glass from a movie car that had been used in an action sequence, installing it in a small window that gave me a view of the street while keeping me protected. The heating system required the most creativity. The wood-burning stove was efficient, but I needed backup options in case something happened to my fuel supply. I rigged up a system using car radiators and antifreeze that could capture and redistribute heat throughout the space. I also modified several car heaters to run off my battery system, giving me multiple ways to stay warm even if one system failed. Redundancy was key. In stunt work, you always had backup safety systems because your life depended on them. The same principle applied here. Water storage and purification became my next priority. I had been collecting rainwater and melted snow, but the volcanic ash made everything toxic. I needed filtration systems that could handle contaminated water and make it safe to drink. Using materials from car air filters and fuel filters, I built a multi-stage system that could process even heavily polluted water into something drinkable. It was not perfect, but it was better than the alternatives most people had. Food storage was perhaps the most critical challenge. I had maybe 60 days worth of canned goods and dried supplies, but that assumed normal consumption. In the cold, my body was burning more calories just to stay warm. I needed to stretch what I had while also finding ways to supplement it. I set up simple traps for small animals, rigged fishing lines through holes in the floor to catch anything in the storm drains below, and even started sprouting seeds in containers near my heat sources. Every calorie mattered now. The neighborhood around me was changing daily, and not for the better. Houses that had been occupied a week earlier were now empty, their windows broken and doors hanging open. Some families had packed up and left for warmer climates, but most had simply died from the cold, hunger, or violence. The few remaining survivors were becoming increasingly desperate and dangerous. I watched through my bulletproof glass window as groups of people moved through the streets, breaking into abandoned homes and fighting over whatever they found. On August 23rd, I witnessed the first organized raid in my neighborhood. A group of 8 men had formed a hunting party, moving systematically from house to house and taking everything of value. They were not random looters. They had a system with scouts, lookouts, and designated roles for each member. They were adapting to the new world faster than most people, and that made them extremely dangerous. I watched them work for 3 hours, noting their patterns and weaknesses in case they decided to target my garage. The raid leader was a man I recognized from the local gym, someone who had seemed normal and civilized just a month earlier. Now, he was carrying a machete and directing his group like a military unit. Desperation had transformed ordinary people into predators, and the transformation was happening faster than I had expected. The social contracts that kept civilization functioning had dissolved completely, replaced by the brutal logic of survival at any cost. That night I realized that complete isolation was not sustainable. I needed information about what was happening beyond my immediate area, and I needed allies who could help watch for threats. But I also knew that most potential allies would become liabilities, people who would consume my resources without contributing enough to justify the risk. I needed to be extremely selective about who I trusted and who I helped. The decision was made for me on August 26th. I was working on reinforcing my roof when I heard screaming from the house across the street. Through my window, I could see a woman and a young child running from 3 men who were chasing them with clubs and knives. The woman was carrying a medical bag, which meant she was probably a nurse or doctor. The child looked to be about 8 years old, scared but not injured yet. Every instinct I had developed over 15 years of stunt work told me to stay hidden, to not get involved, to protect my own position. but something about the child's face reminded me of my nephew, and I found myself moving toward the door before I had consciously made the decision to help. I grabbed my welding torch and fired it up, creating a bright flame that I could use as both a weapon and a distraction. The three men stopped chasing when they saw me emerge from my garage. They had probably assumed the building was empty like most others in the neighborhood. The welding torch gave them pause because it was clearly dangerous, and because it meant I had access to power and fuel in a world where most people were cold and in the dark. That made me someone to be cautious around rather than someone to attack immediately. I did not say anything to the men. I just stood there with the torch burning, making it clear that anyone who wanted to continue their pursuit would have to go through me first. After a few minutes of tense staring, they decided the woman and child were not worth the risk and moved on to easier targets. The whole confrontation lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. The woman and child approached me carefully, clearly unsure whether I was a threat or a potential ally. The woman introduced herself as Maria Santos, a registered nurse, who had been working at the county hospital until it closed 3 days earlier. The child was her son Carlos, 8 years old and clearly traumatized by everything he had witnessed. They had been living in their car since their apartment building was taken over by a violent group, and they were looking for someplace safe to spend the night. I faced the most difficult decision I had made since the eruption began. Every survival instinct told me that taking in refugees would stretch my resources and make me more vulnerable to attack. But Maria was a nurse, which meant she had medical knowledge that could be invaluable if someone got sick or injured. And Carlos was just a child who had done nothing to deserve the hell that the world had become. I made a choice that went against everything I had planned. I let them into my garage and shared my heat, my food, and my shelter. Maria immediately proved her value by treating a cut on my hand that had become infected, using medical supplies from her bag and knowledge that probably saved me from serious complications. Carlos was quiet and well-behaved, clearly understanding that his survival depended on not causing problems for the adults trying to keep him alive. That first night with Maria and Carlos taught me something important about survival in this new world. Resources were critical, but knowledge and skills were even more valuable. Maria knew things about medicine and human physiology that I could never learn from books. I knew things about mechanics and improvised engineering that could keep us alive when our equipment failed. Together, we had a better chance of surviving than either of us would have had alone. But taking them in also made my garage a more obvious target. 3 people generated more heat, more noise, and more visible signs of occupation than one person alone. Maria was smart enough to understand the risks, and she immediately started helping me improve our defensive measures. She knew how to make improvised medical supplies from household materials, how to treat injuries without proper equipment, and how to recognize signs of disease before they became deadly. Carlos surprised me with his adaptability. Despite everything he had been through, he was eager to help and quick to learn. I started teaching him basic mechanical skills, partly to keep him occupied, and partly because those skills might save his life someday. He learned how to check fluid levels in vehicles, how to use simple tools, and how to spot signs of mechanical problems before they became critical failures. In return, he became our early warning system, with sharp eyes and keen hearing that often detected approaching danger before Maria or I noticed it. The 3 of us developed routines and systems that maximized our efficiency while minimizing our exposure to risk. We took turns on watch duty, with one person always monitoring the street for threats while the others worked or rested. We practiced emergency procedures for different scenarios: what to do if the garage was breached, where to meet if we got separated, how to communicate without making noise that would attract attention. Maria's medical knowledge became essential almost immediately. The stress of constant survival was affecting all of us physically, and the poor nutrition and contaminated environment were taking their toll. She taught me how to recognize signs of malnutrition, hypothermia, and other conditions that could kill us if not treated early. More importantly, she knew how to treat these conditions with limited supplies and improvised materials. On September 2nd, we faced our first real test as a group. A larger band of raiders, maybe 12 people, spent most of the day examining our garage and the surrounding buildings. They were clearly planning something, but they were also being cautious. The fact that our building showed signs of occupation but also signs of strong defenses made them hesitant to attack immediately. I spent that day preparing for a siege, checking my weapons and defensive systems while Maria prepared medical supplies for treating injuries. Carlos helped by organizing our emergency supplies and making sure our escape routes were clear. We all knew that if this group decided to attack, we would be outnumbered 4-1, and our survival would depend on preparation and smart tactics rather than superior firepower. The attack never came that day, but the psychological pressure was enormous. Knowing that hostile people were watching us, planning against us, and waiting for the right moment to strike was almost worse than an actual assault. We spent the night in shifts, with one person always awake and watching while the others tried to rest. None of us slept well, and by morning we were all exhausted and on edge. That experience taught me something else about survival in this new world. The physical challenges of staying warm, fed, and healthy were enormous, but the psychological challenges were equally dangerous. Fear, stress, and constant vigilance could break down your judgment and decision-making ability just as effectively as hunger or cold. We needed to find ways to maintain our mental health and morale, or we would make mistakes that would get us killed. Maria proved invaluable in this area as well. Her medical training included understanding how trauma and stress affected the mind, and she knew techniques for managing anxiety and maintaining emotional stability under pressure. She taught Carlos and me breathing exercises, relaxation techniques, and ways to process the horrible things we were witnessing without becoming paralyzed by fear or anger. By September 5th, we had settled into patterns that seemed sustainable. Our food was lasting longer than I had expected because we were being extremely careful about portions and waste. Our heating system was efficient enough to keep the garage livable even as outside temperatures continued to drop. Most importantly, we were working as a team instead of 3 individuals competing for the same resources. But I knew this stability was temporary. Winter was still months away, and conditions were going to get much worse before they got better. The raiders who had been watching us had not given up. They had just moved on to easier targets temporarily. Eventually, they would come back with more people and better plans. When that happened, we would need to be ready to make hard choices about whether to fight, flee, or try to negotiate. The garage that had started as my personal fortress was becoming something larger and more complex. It was now a refuge for 3 people with different skills, needs, and vulnerabilities. Managing that complexity required all the organizational skills I had developed as a stunt coordinator, but the stakes were infinitely higher. In Hollywood, mistakes meant reshooting scenes and going over budget. Here, mistakes meant death for people I was starting to care about as family. I spent my evenings that week planning for multiple scenarios, trying to anticipate what challenges we would face in the coming weeks. Food supplies, fuel for heating, medical emergencies, and defense against increasingly organized threats were all problems that required immediate solutions. But I also knew that our biggest challenge might be maintaining unity and trust within our small group as conditions became more desperate and decisions became more difficult. Looking back now, I realized that those early days with Maria and Carlos were when I stopped being a survivor and started being a leader. The responsibility for keeping other people alive changed how I thought about every decision and every risk. I could no longer make choices based solely on what was best for me. I had to consider what was best for all of us, even when those interests conflicted. That transition from individual survival to group survival would define everything that happened next, and it would determine whether we lived or died when the real tests began. Day 37 was when I learned you cannot hide from desperate people forever. Maria, Carlos, and I had been living in relative safety for 11 days, developing routines that made our garage fortress feel almost normal. We had established watch schedules, rationed our food carefully, and even managed to create small comforts that made the endless cold bearable. But on the morning of September 7th, our illusion of security was shattered by smoke. I had been careful about using the wood-burning stove only at night, when the smoke would be harder to see against the dark sky. But Carlos had been running. A fever for 2 days, and Maria insisted we needed to keep the garage warmer during the day to help him recover. Against my better judgment, I fired up the stove at dawn to take the chill off the air. That single decision changed everything. The smoke from our chimney was spotted by a roving group of survivors who had been systematically searching the neighborhood for signs of life. I should have known better. In stunt work, you never do anything that makes you visible to cameras unless it is part of the planned sequence. The same rule applied here, but I had let concern for Carlos override my tactical thinking. It was a mistake that nearly got us all killed. Around 10 in the morning, I heard voices outside the garage, not the desperate, chaotic sounds of random looters, but organized conversation between people who were coordinating their actions. I moved to my bulletproof window and saw 12 people gathered in the street, studying our building with the systematic attention of professionals. This was not a random encounter. They had come here specifically because they knew we were inside. The group was led by a man named Torres, someone I recognized from the local hardware store where I had bought supplies before the eruption. He had always seemed reasonable and helpful, but the person standing in my street was transformed by desperation and the authority that came from controlling other people's survival. He was carrying a shotgun and wearing a heavy coat that looked like it had been taken from someone else. The 11 people with him included 3 women, 2 teenagers, and 6 adult men, all armed with various improvised weapons. Torres called out to the garage, addressing me by name. Somehow he knew who I was and what I did for a living. In a community as small as ours had become, information traveled fast, and my reputation as someone with mechanical skills and resources had apparently spread. He spoke in a calm, reasonable tone, explaining that his group was just trying to survive like everyone else, and that we should work together instead of hiding from each other. The conversation that followed through the steel-reinforced door revealed the complexity of survival politics in this new world. Torres was not simply a predator looking to take what we had. He was the leader of a group that included families with children, and he genuinely believed that combining resources was the smart approach to long-term survival. But he was also desperate enough to use force if negotiation failed. And the weapons his people carried made their intentions clear. Maria and Carlos stayed hidden while I negotiated through the door. Torres knew there were other people inside because he had seen multiple sets of footprints in the snow around the garage. He wanted to know how many people I was sheltering, what supplies we had, and whether we would be willing to join his larger group. His questions were reasonable, but the underlying threat was obvious. We could cooperate voluntarily, or we could be forced to cooperate after they broke down our defenses. I found myself in the position of making life or death decisions for 3 people based on incomplete information about 12 others. Torres claimed his group had established a secure base in an abandoned warehouse, with better heating, more space, and organized patrols for security. But he also admitted they were short on food, medical supplies, and technical expertise. They needed what we had, and they were not going to take no for an answer. The negotiation lasted 3 hours, with Torres becoming more impatient and his people becoming more agitated as time passed. I could see them through my window, examining our defenses and discussing the best ways to breach them. Several of them had crowbars and sledgehammers, and they were clearly experienced at breaking into buildings. My steel plating and reinforced doors would slow them down, but they would not stop a determined assault by 12 people. I made a decision that went against every instinct I had developed about trusting strangers. I agreed to let 6 of Torres's people shelter in our garage temporarily, while refusing to accommodate his entire group. It was a compromise that satisfied nobody completely, but it avoided immediate violence while giving me time to assess whether these people were potential allies or enemies pretending to be friends. The 6 people who entered our garage that afternoon changed our dynamic completely. There were 2 families, Jim and Susan Morrison with their teenage daughter Rachel, and Miguel and Elena Vasquez with their 10-year-old son David. All of them were scared, cold, and hungry, but they were also grateful for shelter and willing to contribute to our collective survival. The problem was that our garage was not designed for 9 people, and our resources were already stretched thin. Food became the immediate crisis. I had been rationing supplies for 3 people over 60 days, but now we had 9 people who needed to eat. Our daily consumption tripled overnight, which meant our food would last maybe 3 weeks instead of 2 months. Maria and I spent that first evening recalculating everything, trying to figure out how to keep everyone alive long enough for conditions to improve or for better options to emerge. Jim Morrison proved to be valuable immediately. He had been an electrician before the eruption, and he understood power systems in ways that complemented my mechanical knowledge. Together, we improved our battery array and heating efficiency, reducing our fuel consumption while increasing our comfort level. His daughter Rachel was 17 and mature enough to help with watch duties and food preparation. Miguel had worked in construction, so he understood building modification and fortification better than anyone else in our group. But Elena Vasquez was our most valuable addition. She had been a teacher and had experience managing groups of children under stress. More importantly, she had psychological training that helped all of us cope with the constant anxiety and fear that came with our situation. She understood how to maintain morale, resolve conflicts, and keep people focused on survival tasks instead of dwelling on everything we had lost. The first week with our expanded group taught me lessons about leadership that no amount of stunt coordination had prepared me for. In Hollywood, everyone on set was a professional who understood their role and was being paid to follow directions. Here, I was dealing with scared, traumatized people who had lost everything and were looking for someone to blame or someone to follow. The line between leadership and dictatorship was thinner than I had ever imagined. Our resource situation was becoming critical faster than I had anticipated. 9 people generated more heat, more noise, and more waste than our systems could handle efficiently. The garage that had been spacious for 3 people was cramped and tense with 9. Privacy became impossible, patience wore thin, and small disagreements threatened to escalate into serious conflicts. I found myself mediating disputes about everything from sleeping arrangements to food portions to bathroom schedules. The psychological pressure was affecting everyone differently. Carlos seemed to thrive with more people around, finally having other children to interact with and adults who could help entertain him. Rachel Morrison was struggling with the loss of her normal teenage life, alternating between helpful maturity and sullen rebellion. The adults were all dealing with grief for their lost homes, jobs, and futures, but they were trying to stay strong for the children. On September 15th, we discovered that someone in our group was stealing food. Small amounts were disappearing from our carefully rationed supplies, not enough to cause immediate crisis, but enough to disrupt our careful calculations. The theft created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that threatened to destroy the trust we needed to function as a team. Everyone became a suspect, and everyone was watching everyone else for signs of deception. Maria and I conducted a careful investigation, checking our storage areas and monitoring consumption patterns. We eventually determined that Jim Morrison was taking extra food, not for himself but for his daughter Rachel, who was not getting enough calories to maintain her energy level. He was trying to be a good father in impossible circumstances, but his actions were threatening everyone's survival. The discovery forced us to confront the harsh mathematics of survival. There simply was not enough food for everyone to eat as much as they needed. The confrontation with Jim was one of the most difficult conversations I had ever had. He was not a bad person or a selfish person. He was a father trying to keep his child alive, and he was making decisions based on love rather than logic. But his actions were putting everyone at risk, and they violated the trust that held our group together. We had to establish rules and consequences, or our small community would collapse into chaos. We decided that Jim would take on extra duties to compensate for the stolen food, and that Rachel would receive slightly larger portions to address her legitimate nutritional needs. It was not a perfect solution, but it resolved the immediate crisis while establishing the principle that individual actions had to be evaluated based on their impact on group survival. The incident also made everyone more aware of how quickly desperation could turn good people into threats to their own community. September 18th brought our first real external threat since the group had expanded. Torres returned with his remaining 6 people, but this time they were not interested in negotiation. They had been watching our garage for days. counting the people going in and out, and they had concluded that we had more resources than we were sharing. They demanded that we either join their larger group or give them half of our supplies. The reasonable tone was gone, replaced by barely controlled aggression. The siege began at dawn on September 19th. Torres's people surrounded our garage and made it clear that nobody was leaving until we met their demands. They had brought enough food and fuel to wait us out, and they were prepared to use force if necessary. For the first time since the eruption, I faced the possibility of actual combat against other human beings. All my years of staged fights and choreographed action sequences had not prepared me for the reality of people who wanted to hurt us for real. I spent that day preparing for a battle I hoped would never come, checking my improvised weapons and defensive systems while trying to keep the families calm and organized. My stunt pyrotechnics became critical assets. I had flash powder, smoke bombs, and other special effects materials that could be weaponized if necessary. More importantly, I had the knowledge to create improvised explosives from automotive chemicals and materials we had in the garage. Maria proved her value again by preparing medical supplies for treating injuries, setting up a triage area, and training the other adults in basic first aid. She understood that if fighting broke out, people would get hurt, and our survival might depend on our ability to treat wounds quickly and effectively. Her calm professionalism helped keep everyone focused on practical preparations instead of panicking about possibilities we could not control. The children were our biggest vulnerability and our strongest motivation. Carlos, David, and Rachel represented the future we were fighting to protect, but they also represented additional people who could not defend themselves if our defenses were breached. Elena took charge of keeping them calm and occupied, but she also taught them basic emergency procedures in case they needed to hide or escape during an attack. On the second day of the siege, Torres escalated the pressure by cutting off our water supply. He had found the main line that fed our building and damaged it enough to stop the flow. We still had stored water for drinking, but we could no longer collect additional supplies from rain or melted snow. The message was clear: surrender now, or watch your resources dwindle until surrender became inevitable. That night I made the decision that defined everything that happened next. Instead of waiting for Torres to wear us down gradually, I decided to break the siege with a show of force that would convince him to find easier targets. I used my flash powder and automotive chemicals to create a series of controlled explosions around the perimeter of our building, designed to look more dangerous than they actually were, while creating enough chaos for me to slip outside and disable their vehicles. The plan worked better than I had hoped. The explosions created enough confusion and fear to scatter Torres's people temporarily, and I was able to damage their transportation enough to strand them in our neighborhood without easy escape routes. More importantly, the demonstration convinced them that we had capabilities they had not anticipated, making us a more dangerous target than they were prepared to handle. Torres withdrew his people the next morning, but not before making it clear that this was not over. He had lost face in front of his group, and he would need to restore his authority by proving that nobody could defy him without consequences. The siege was broken, but the larger conflict was just beginning. I had used the last of my flash powder in the explosions, and I did not know if I would be able to create similar effects again when the next threat emerged. The aftermath of the siege revealed cracks in our group that had been hidden by the immediate external threat. Some people thought I had been too aggressive, that negotiation might have achieved better results with less risk. Others thought I had not been aggressive enough, that we should have attacked Torres's people while they were disorganized. Everyone had opinions about what we should have done differently, and those opinions created divisions that threatened our unity. Jim Morrison was the most vocal critic of my leadership decisions. He argued that my military-style approach was putting his family at unnecessary risk, and that we should have tried harder to find peaceful solutions. His criticism was valid in some ways, but it also undermined the authority I needed to make quick decisions in crisis situations. Leadership in survival situations required people to follow orders immediately, without debate or second-guessing, because hesitation could get everyone killed. The food situation was becoming desperate despite our efforts to stretch supplies. We were down to maybe 10 days of remaining food, and winter was still 2 months away. Hunting and foraging were nearly impossible in the contaminated environment, and other survivor groups were competing for the same limited resources. We needed to find additional supplies, but any expedition outside our secure garage carried enormous risks. Maria suggested that we needed to start thinking beyond immediate survival toward long-term sustainability. She had been keeping detailed records of our consumption, health status, and resource usage, and her analysis showed that our current approach was not viable indefinitely. We needed to either find more supplies, reduce our group size, or develop new sources of food and fuel. All of those options involved difficult choices that would test our unity and resolve. On September 25th, we discovered something that changed our entire situation. Miguel had been exploring the storm drains beneath our garage looking for alternative water sources when he found evidence of a much larger survivor community operating in the underground tunnels. Fresh footprints, recent food waste, and makeshift shelters suggested that dozens of people were living in the tunnel system, possibly connected to other buildings throughout the neighborhood. The discovery presented both opportunities and threats. If we could make contact with this underground community, we might be able to trade skills and resources for food and supplies. But we also risked exposure to diseases, criminal elements, or organized groups that might be more dangerous than Torres's people. The decision about whether to make contact would determine our survival strategy for the coming weeks. As I prepared to send Miguel back into the tunnels with a small party to investigate further, I realized that our situation had evolved far beyond what I had planned when I first fortified my garage. We were no longer just trying to survive as individuals or even as a small family group. We were becoming part of a larger network of survivor communities, each with their own resources, needs, and agendas. The skills that had kept us alive so far would still be important, but we would also need diplomatic abilities, trade relationships, and political awareness to navigate the complex social landscape that was emerging from the ruins of civilization. The garage that had started as my personal fortress was now the center of a web of relationships and obligations that I was still learning to understand. Our choices in the coming days would determine not just whether we lived or died, but what kind of people we became in the process of surviving. The Ice Age had destroyed the world we knew, but it was also creating opportunities to build something new, something that might be better than what we had lost if we were smart enough and strong enough to seize those opportunities. Day 55 brought me face to face with the hardest decision of my life. The temperature had dropped to 45 degrees below zero. Our fuel reserves were nearly exhausted, and Carlos's health was deteriorating rapidly in the brutal cold. For weeks, I had been telling myself that conditions would improve, that we just needed to survive a little longer before help arrived or the weather changed. But standing in my garage that morning, watching my breath freeze in the air despite our wood-burning stove, I finally accepted the truth I had been avoiding. We could stay and eventually die, or we could risk everything on a desperate journey south toward Mexico. The decision had been building for days as our situation became increasingly hopeless. Our food supplies were down to maybe 7 days if we continued strict rationing. The wood for our stove would last perhaps 2 weeks if we used it sparingly. But sparingly was not enough to keep 9 people alive in temperatures that belonged in Antarctica, not Southern California. Most critically, Carlos had developed a persistent cough that Maria could not treat with our limited medical supplies. The child needed warmth, proper nutrition, and clean air, none of which we could provide in our makeshift fortress. Miguel's exploration of the underground tunnel system had revealed both opportunities and dangers that complicated our options. The survivor community living beneath the streets was larger than we had initially thought. Maybe 50 or 60 people scattered through interconnected basements and storm drains. Some of them were organized and helpful, sharing information about resource locations and safe routes through the city. But others were predatory groups that controlled territory through violence and intimidation. The tunnels offered potential, shelter, and connections, but they also represented a different kind of trap. One where we would be dependent on the goodwill of strangers who had their own desperate agendas. I had been conducting scouting missions on my modified Harley for 2 weeks, mapping potential routes south and assessing the challenges we would face on the road. The motorcycle was perfectly suited for reconnaissance work, with its reinforced, frame armor plating, and ability to navigate terrain that would stop cars or trucks. More importantly, it was quiet enough to avoid attracting attention from hostile groups and efficient enough to travel long distances on minimal fuel. During these scouting runs, I had identified 3 possible routes to Mexico, each with different advantages and risks. The first route followed the major highways, which offered the fastest travel time, but also the greatest exposure to other survivor groups and potential military checkpoints. The second route used back roads and smaller highways, which were slower but less likely to be monitored or controlled by organized groups. The third route was almost entirely off-road, following motorcycle trails and fire roads through mountainous terrain that would be nearly impossible for larger vehicles, but might be passable for a small group on foot or motorcycle. Each route presented challenges that could prove fatal. The highways were faster but more dangerous, with reports of armed gangs controlling key choke points and demanding tribute from travelers. The back roads were safer but longer, requiring more fuel and food than we might be able to carry. The off-road route was the most secure but also the most physically demanding, requiring everyone in our group to be able to hike long distances in extreme cold while carrying their own supplies. During my scouting missions, I had also been gathering intelligence about conditions further south. Radio communications were sporadic and unreliable, but the reports I was able to intercept suggested that the Ice Age effects were less severe in Mexico and the southwestern United States. Temperatures were still below normal, but they were apparently above freezing in many areas, and some agricultural production was continuing. More importantly, there were reports of organized relief efforts and established refugee camps where survivors could find food, shelter, and medical care. The information was encouraging, but I also knew that thousands of other people were probably making the same calculations we were. The roads south would be crowded with desperate refugees, creating competition for resources and opportunities for conflict. We would not be traveling through empty wilderness. We would be joining a massive migration of survivors, all heading toward the same destinations with the same urgent needs. Maria's medical assessment of our group's condition provided the final push toward making the decision to leave. Carlos's cough was getting worse despite her efforts to treat it, and she was concerned about pneumonia or other respiratory infections that could kill him quickly in our current environment. Jim Morrison was showing signs of malnutrition and depression that were affecting his ability to contribute to group tasks. Most concerning, everyone was losing weight and strength at a rate that would make us increasingly vulnerable to both environmental threats and human predators. She also pointed out that our current shelter, while effective for short-term survival, was not sustainable for the months or years that this ice age might last. The garage was not insulated well enough for the extreme temperatures we were experiencing. Our heating system was consuming fuel faster than we could replace it, and the psychological stress of confinement was affecting everyone's mental health. We needed either a better shelter or a route to a warmer climate, and better shelter options were becoming increasingly scarce as other survivor groups claimed the most defensible locations. The conversation about leaving divided our group along predictable lines. The adults with children were most motivated to risk the journey, understanding that staying meant watching their kids slowly deteriorate and eventually die. The adults without children were more cautious, preferring the known risks of our current situation to the unknown dangers of travel. Jim Morrison was the most vocal opponent of leaving, arguing that we should wait for government rescue operations or for conditions to improve naturally. I understood Jim's position, but I also knew that waiting was not a realistic option. Government rescue operations had stopped weeks ago as the scope of the disaster overwhelmed all available resources. The military was focused on protecting major population centers and critical infrastructure, not rescuing small groups of survivors from suburban neighborhoods. We were on our own, and our survival depended on our ability to make difficult decisions without outside help or guarantees. The planning process for our exodus took 3 days and involved everyone in our group. We needed to determine what supplies to take, what to leave behind, how to transport everything we needed, and how to maintain security during the journey. Every decision involved trade-offs between weight, value, and necessity. Food and water were essential, but they were also heavy and bulky. Fuel for heating and transportation was critical, but it was dangerous to transport and created fire hazards. Medical supplies could save lives, but they took up space that might be needed for other essentials. Miguel and Elena Vasquez were strong advocates for the journey, partly because they had family in Mexico who might be able to help us if we could reach them. Their 10-year-old son David was healthy and resilient enough to handle the physical demands of travel, and their construction and teaching backgrounds gave them practical skills that would be valuable on the road. They also understood Spanish, which would be crucial if we successfully reached Mexico and needed to communicate with local authorities or other survivors. Rachel Morrison surprised everyone by supporting the journey despite her father's opposition. At 17, she was old enough to understand the mathematics of our situation and mature enough to accept the risks involved in staying or leaving. She had been keeping her own records of our food consumption and fuel usage, and her calculations confirmed that we would not survive the winter in our current location. Her support for leaving created additional pressure on Jim to reconsider his position. Susan Morrison was torn between supporting her husband and protecting her daughter. She could see that Jim's opposition to leaving was based partly on fear and partly on his reluctance to admit that their situation was hopeless. But she could also see that Rachel was right about the impossibility of staying. The conflict within their family reflected the larger tensions in our group between hope and realism, between caution and desperation. The breakthrough came when Maria presented her medical analysis in terms that everyone could understand. She explained that Carlos had maybe 2 weeks before his respiratory condition became life-threatening, that our limited medical supplies would be exhausted within days, and that the cold was affecting everyone's immune systems in ways that made serious illness increasingly likely. She was not arguing for or against leaving. She was simply presenting the medical facts that would determine our survival regardless of what we decided to do. Jim finally agreed to support the journey after Rachel told him privately that she would rather die trying to reach safety than die slowly in the garage. His daughter's courage shamed him into reconsidering his position, and he began contributing constructively to our planning efforts. His electrical knowledge was valuable for determining what equipment we could take and how to maintain communications during travel. We decided to travel as a convoy using the 2 remaining functional cars in my garage and my modified Harley as a scout vehicle. The cars would carry our supplies, the children, and the adults who were not capable of walking long distances. The motorcycle would range ahead to identify threats and obstacles, find safe routes around problems, and locate resources like fuel and food along the way. It was not an ideal arrangement, but it was the best compromise we could achieve with our available resources. The vehicle preparation took 2 full days and required all of my mechanical knowledge and improvisation skills. Both cars needed extensive modifications to handle the extreme cold, rough roads, and potential combat situations we might encounter. I reinforced the bodies with steel plating from other vehicles, upgraded the heating systems to keep passengers warm during long drives, and modified the engines to run on lower quality fuel that might be all we could find on the road. The most critical modification was creating hidden storage compartments for our most valuable supplies. Food, medical equipment, ammunition, and fuel needed to be concealed from casual inspection while remaining accessible to us during emergencies. I used techniques I had learned building movie cars, creating false panels and hidden compartments that would not be obvious to raiders or other survivors who might search our vehicles. Maria took charge of organizing our medical supplies and creating portable treatment kits that could be grabbed quickly if we needed to abandon the vehicles. She also prepared emergency medical protocols for different scenarios we might encounter, treating injuries sustained during travel, dealing with exposure and hypothermia, and managing medical emergencies without access to hospitals or professional equipment. Elena organized our food supplies with the same systematic approach she had used as a teacher, creating daily ration packets that would ensure everyone received adequate nutrition while stretching our supplies as far as possible. She also prepared educational materials and activities to keep the children occupied during long hours of travel, understanding that bored and frightened kids could create safety hazards and morale problems. On October 2nd, we conducted our final equipment checks and loaded the vehicles with everything we had decided to take. The process was emotional for everyone, as we were forced to leave behind personal possessions, family photographs, and other items that connected us to our previous lives. The garage that had been our home and fortress for weeks was being abandoned, along with all the improvements and modifications we had made to survive. I spent the last night in the garage testing my radio equipment and trying to establish contact with survivor groups along our planned route. Communications were difficult because of atmospheric interference from the volcanic ash, but I was able to confirm that some of the refugee camps in Mexico were still operational and accepting new arrivals. The information was encouraging, but I also intercepted reports of increasing violence along the major travel routes as competition for resources intensified. The departure on October 3rd was delayed by a mechanical problem with one of the cars that took 3 hours to diagnose and repair. The delay was frustrating, but it also reminded us how dependent we were on our vehicles and how critical my mechanical skills would be during the journey. If the cars broke down in hostile territory or extreme weather, our survival would depend on my ability to fix them quickly with limited tools and supplies. As we finally pulled out of the garage at noon, I took one last look at the fortress that had kept us alive for 45 days. The steel plating over the windows, the reinforced doors, and the improvised heating systems represented weeks of hard work and careful planning. But they also represented a defensive mindset that was no longer adequate for our situation. We were transitioning from passive survival to active survival, from hiding from threats to confronting them directly. The first day of travel revealed problems that no amount of planning could have anticipated. The roads were in worse condition than my scouting missions had suggested, with ice, debris, and abandoned vehicles creating constant obstacles. Our progress was slower than expected, and our fuel consumption was higher than calculated. Most concerning, we encountered other survivor groups within hours of leaving our neighborhood, including armed patrols that demanded explanations for our movements and destination. The interactions with other survivors were tense, but not violent, partly because our convoy looked organized and well-equipped enough to present a credible threat to potential attackers. The modifications I had made to our vehicles, combined with the disciplined behavior of our group members, created an impression of military or paramilitary capability that discouraged casual aggression. But I also knew that impression would not protect us against truly desperate people or well-organized criminal groups. By evening, we had traveled only 30 miles from our starting point, far short of our planned 50-mile goal for the first day. We found shelter in an abandoned truck stop that provided some protection from the wind and concealment from other travelers. The building was partially damaged and had obviously been looted multiple times, but it offered more space and better defensive positions than our vehicles alone. That night, as we huddled around a small fire in the truck stop and planned the next day's route, I realized that our journey was going to be even more challenging than I had anticipated. We were not just traveling through a harsh environment. We were navigating a complex social landscape, where every interaction carried the potential for cooperation or conflict. Our survival would depend not just on our mechanical and practical skills, but on our ability to read people quickly and make good decisions about who to trust and who to avoid. Carlos's condition seemed to improve slightly with the change of environment and the excitement of being on an adventure, rather than trapped in a confined space. His cough was still concerning, but his spirits were higher than they had been in weeks. Maria was cautiously optimistic about his chances if we could reach warmer climate quickly enough, but she also warned that the stress and exposure of travel could worsen his condition if we encountered serious delays or obstacles. The children adapted to travel better than most of the adults, treating the journey as an exciting expedition rather than a desperate flight from death. David and Carlos became enthusiastic scouts, helping to spot potential problems and resources from the car windows. Rachel took on additional responsibilities for navigation and communication, proving that her maturity and intelligence were valuable assets for group survival. As I prepared for the second day of travel, checking our vehicles and equipment in the pre-dawn darkness, I reflected on how much our situation had changed since the first day of the eruption. We had evolved from individuals trying to survive alone, to a small group sharing resources, to a mobile community actively seeking better opportunities for survival. The skills that had kept us alive so far would continue to be important, but we were also developing new capabilities and relationships that would define our future. The road ahead was uncertain and dangerous, but it also represented hope in a way that staying in the garage never could. We were no longer just trying to survive until rescue arrived or conditions improved. We were taking active control of our destiny, making choices based on our own assessment of risks and opportunities, rather than waiting for external forces to determine our fate. The Ice Age had destroyed the world we knew, but it had also created opportunities to build something new if we were brave enough and smart enough to seize them. Day 73 brought us to rock bottom in the middle of nowhere with no fuel, no food, and a dying child. We were stranded at an abandoned truck stop somewhere between Bakersfield and the Mexican border, our convoy reduced to 2 broken-down cars and my motorcycle with an empty gas tank. Carlos was unconscious with fever, his breathing shallow, and labored despite everything Maria could do with our dwindling medical supplies. That morning, as I watched my breath freeze in the air inside our supposed shelter, I learned what real desperation looks like and what it means to face the possibility that all your efforts have been for nothing. The breakdown had happened 18 hours earlier during what should have been our final push toward the border. We were maybe 200 miles from safety when the transmission in our lead car failed completely, grinding to a halt with a sound like metal tearing apart. Within minutes, our second car developed engine problems that Miguel and I could not diagnose or repair with our limited tools and roadside conditions. In the span of 1 hour, our carefully planned exodus had become a survival situation worse than anything we had faced in the garage. The truck stop where we took shelter was a monument to the collapse of normal commerce and transportation. It had been looted multiple times, with broken windows, overturned furniture, and graffiti covering most surfaces. But it still had a roof, walls that blocked the wind, and enough space for our group to spread out and organize our remaining supplies. More importantly, it was off the main highway, reducing our visibility to other travelers who might see us as targets or competitors for scarce resources. Our inventory that morning revealed the mathematics of disaster. We had food for maybe 2 days if we continued strict rationing, water for perhaps 4 days if we found ways to collect and purify more, and no fuel at all for heating or transportation. The medical supplies that had kept Carlos alive were nearly exhausted, and Maria was running out of options for treating his respiratory infection. Most critically, we were at least 50 miles from the nearest settlement that might have resources or help, and none of us were in condition to walk that distance in the extreme cold. I spent the morning conducting a detailed assessment of our situation, checking every system and supply with the systematic approach I had learned during 15 years of stunt coordination. In Hollywood, equipment failures during dangerous sequences could be fatal, so you always had backup plans and backup plans for your backup plans. But our current situation had exhausted all my contingencies. We needed resources we did not have, in quantities we could not obtain, within timeframes that were probably impossible to meet. The decision to attempt a solo rescue mission went against every principle of group survival I had learned over the previous 2 months. Splitting up reduced our collective security, used precious fuel that might be needed for other purposes, and risked losing our most experienced member if something went wrong. But Carlos was dying, and traditional survival strategies were not adequate for the medical emergency we faced. Someone had to take extreme risks to find help, and my modified Harley was our only remaining transportation. I spent 2 hours preparing the motorcycle for what might be the most dangerous stunt of my career. The bike had been my primary reconnaissance vehicle throughout our journey, and I had modified it specifically for extreme conditions and emergency situations. The armor plating that protected the engine and fuel tank had already saved us from attacks by other survivor groups. The reinforced suspension system had allowed us to navigate terrain that would have stopped normal motorcycles. The custom storage compartments held emergency supplies and communication equipment that might be crucial for a rescue mission. The route I planned would take me south toward the border, following secondary roads and off-road trails that I had scouted during our earlier travels. The goal was to find an active survivor settlement, refugee camp, or government facility that could provide medical assistance and transportation for our group. It was a long shot, but it was the only option that offered any hope of saving Carlos and getting everyone else to safety. Maria understood the risks better than anyone, but she also understood that conventional medical treatment was Carlos's only chance of survival. She prepared a detailed summary of his condition, symptoms, and treatment history that I could present to any medical professionals I encountered. She also gave me specific instructions about medications and equipment that might be available at larger settlements, information that could determine whether emergency treatment would be successful. The goodbye scene with our group was one of the hardest moments of the entire journey. Everyone knew that I might not return, that the motorcycle might break down, or I might encounter hostile survivors who would kill me for my equipment. But they also knew that staying together meant watching Carlos die slowly, while we all gradually succumbed to cold and starvation. Sometimes survival requires accepting unacceptable risks, because all the alternatives are worse. Carlos was barely conscious when I left, but he managed to ask me to bring back help for everyone, not just for him. That 8-year-old child dying from pneumonia in an abandoned truck stop was more concerned about the welfare of our group than about his own survival. His courage and selflessness gave me the motivation I needed to attempt something that, rationally, should have been impossible. The midnight ride through frozen wasteland was the most physically and mentally demanding challenge I had ever faced. Temperatures were well below zero. Visibility was limited by blowing snow and volcanic ash, and the roads were covered with ice that made motorcycle travel extremely dangerous. But the Harley performed exactly as I had designed her to perform, maintaining traction on treacherous surfaces and providing enough protection from the elements to keep me functional despite the extreme conditions. Navigation was the biggest challenge because GPS systems had been unreliable since the eruption, and many of the landmarks I had used during previous scouting missions were obscured by snow or had been altered by the ongoing environmental catastrophe. I was navigating primarily by compass and dead reckoning, using techniques I had learned during wilderness survival training years earlier. Every mile took me further from our group and deeper into unknown territory where a single mistake could strand me permanently. 4 hours into the ride, I discovered something that changed everything. A faint radio signal was broadcasting from somewhere ahead of me, repeating a message in both English and Spanish about a refugee camp accepting new arrivals. The signal was weak and intermittent, but it was clearly recent and professional rather than the desperate amateur broadcasts I had been hearing from other survivor groups. More importantly, the broadcast included specific directions to the camp's location, only 30 miles from my current position. Following the radio signal led me to a settlement that was far more organized and substantial than anything I had encountered since leaving our neighborhood. It was built around a small airport with aircraft hangars converted into housing and workshop spaces, a control tower serving as a command center, and perimeter defenses that looked professionally designed rather than hastily improvised. Generator-powered lights were visible throughout the facility, and I could see people moving purposefully between buildings even at 3 a.m. The approach to the settlement required careful consideration of how to present myself and my situation. Armed guards at the perimeter were clearly screening new arrivals, and my appearance as a lone traveler on a military-style motorcycle might trigger suspicions about my intentions or affiliations. I needed to communicate quickly that I was seeking help rather than representing a threat, while also demonstrating that I had valuable skills and information that would make me worth helping. The guards who intercepted me were professional and disciplined, clearly following established protocols for dealing with new arrivals. They confiscated my weapons temporarily, but treated me with respect and courtesy. That indicated this was a legitimate refugee operation, rather than a predatory group masquerading as helpers. More importantly, they immediately contacted medical personnel when I explained Carlos's condition and our group's location. The settlement leader who interviewed me that morning was someone I recognized from my previous career in Hollywood. Ana Castellanos had been a stunt double and coordinator who had worked on several films with me over the years. She had left the industry 5 years earlier to pursue other interests, but the skills she had developed in coordinating dangerous sequences and managing complex logistics had translated perfectly to organizing survival operations in post-apocalyptic conditions. Anna's recognition of me was the breakthrough that made everything else possible. She knew my reputation for reliability and competence, and she trusted my assessment of our group's value and potential contributions to her community. More importantly, she had resources and transportation that could be deployed immediately for a rescue mission, rather than requiring lengthy negotiations or bureaucratic approval processes. The settlement itself was a revelation of what organized survival could accomplish with proper leadership and resources. 230 people were living in conditions that were not comfortable, but were sustainable and secure. They had established workshops for equipment maintenance and manufacturing, agricultural areas for food production, medical facilities staffed by trained professionals, and communication networks that connected them with other survivor communities throughout the region. Their success was based on principles that I had been learning through trial and error over the previous months. They emphasized skills and contributions over individual needs, maintained strict discipline and organization, while preserving individual dignity, and focused on long-term sustainability rather than short-term survival. Most importantly, they had established trade relationships with other settlements that allowed them to obtain resources and information that would have been impossible to acquire in isolation. The rescue mission for our group was organized and deployed within 6 hours of my arrival. Anna assigned a team of 12 people with 2 four-wheel drive vehicles, medical equipment, and enough supplies to transport our entire group back to the settlement. The speed and efficiency of their response demonstrated the value of having established systems and trained personnel, rather than trying to improvise solutions during every crisis. The journey back to the truck stop took 4 hours through terrain that would have been impassable for our original convoy. The rescue vehicles were specifically modified for extreme conditions, with tracks instead of wheels, enclosed passenger compartments with heating systems, and cargo areas designed for medical transport. The contrast between their equipment and our improvised modifications highlighted how much we had achieved with limited resources, but also how much more was possible with proper organization and planning. Finding our group alive was not guaranteed after the 12 hours I had been away. The truck stop was exactly as I had left it, but Carlos's condition had deteriorated significantly during my absence. Maria had managed to keep him stable using the last of our medical supplies, but she estimated that he had maybe 6 hours before his respiratory system would fail completely. The timing of the rescue was literally a matter of life and death. The medical team that Anna had sent included a registered nurse and a paramedic with experience treating cold exposure and respiratory infections. They immediately began advanced treatment for Carlos using equipment and medications that we could never have obtained on our own. Within 2 hours, his breathing had improved noticeably, and his fever was beginning to respond to antibiotic treatment. The difference between desperate improvisation and professional medical care was the difference between death and recovery. The transportation of our group to the settlement took 8 hours because of Carlos's medical needs and the challenging road conditions. But the journey also provided opportunities to learn about the larger survivor network that was emerging across the southwestern United States and northern Mexico. Anna's settlement was one of 43 known communities that maintained regular communication and trade relationships, sharing information about resources, threats, and opportunities for mutual assistance. The integration process at the settlement was systematic but welcoming, designed to assess new arrivals' skills and needs while providing immediate support for critical requirements like medical care, food, and shelter. Our group was assigned temporary housing in one of the converted hangars, while permanent accommodations were arranged based on our expected contributions to community activities and long-term plans. My mechanical and stunt coordination skills were immediately valuable to the settlement's operations. They had vehicles and equipment that required maintenance and modification, construction projects that needed planning and oversight, and security operations that benefited from tactical thinking and risk assessment. Within days, I was involved in multiple projects that used all the experience I had gained during our journey from my garage to this refuge. Maria's medical knowledge was even more critical because the settlement's medical staff was overworked and understaffed relative to their growing population. Her experience treating trauma and illness with limited resources was exactly what they needed to improve their emergency response capabilities. She was assigned to the medical team immediately and began training other community members in basic healthcare skills. The children adapted to their new environment with the resilience that had kept them alive throughout our journey. Carlos's recovery was rapid once he received proper medical treatment. and within a week he was exploring his new surroundings with the enthusiasm of a normal 8-year-old. David and Rachel found opportunities for education and socialization that had been impossible during our survival phase, reconnecting with aspects of normal childhood and adolescence that the Ice Age had interrupted. The adult members of our group integrated more slowly, dealing with psychological adjustments to living in a larger community after months of small group survival. Jim Morrison struggled initially with relinquishing the independence and self-reliance that had been necessary during our journey, but he eventually found valuable roles in the settlement's electrical and communication systems. Miguel and Elena used their construction and teaching skills to contribute to both physical infrastructure and educational programs. 2 weeks after our arrival, I was assigned to lead supply runs to other settlements and abandoned areas where useful materials could be salvaged. These missions used all the skills I had developed during my career as a stunt coordinator, requiring careful planning, risk assessment, and team coordination under dangerous conditions, but they also provided opportunities to explore the larger world that was emerging from the collapse of industrial civilization. The network of survivor settlements was more extensive and sophisticated than I had imagined during our months of isolation. Communities were specializing in different functions based on their resources and expertise, creating trade relationships that allowed everyone to benefit from collective knowledge and capabilities. Some settlements focused on agriculture and food production, others on manufacturing and equipment maintenance, and still others on communication and coordination between communities. The information I gathered during these supply runs revealed that our experience was typical of what had happened to millions of people throughout the affected regions. Most individuals and small groups had not survived the first 90 days, but those who had made it through the initial crisis were now building the foundation for a new kind of civilization. It was not the world we had lost, but it was potentially a better world in some ways, based on cooperation and sustainability rather than competition and consumption. Anna's leadership of the settlement demonstrated principles that had broader applications for survival and recovery in the post-apocalyptic environment. She emphasized adaptability over rigid planning, collaboration over individual achievement, and long-term thinking over short-term gains. Her background in stunt coordination had taught her to manage complex operations under pressure while maintaining safety standards that protected everyone involved. The communication network between settlements provided regular updates about conditions throughout the region and opportunities for coordination on larger projects. Reports from Mexico indicated that agricultural production was beginning to recover in areas where temperatures had stabilized above freezing, and that government relief operations were expanding to support refugee populations. The prospect of eventual return to some form of normal life was becoming realistic rather than just hopeful. As winter approached, our settlement began preparations for what everyone expected to be the most challenging season since the eruption. Temperatures would drop even further, food production would become impossible, and transportation between communities would be severely limited. But we were no longer facing these challenges as isolated individuals or small groups. We were part of a network that could pool resources, share information, and provide mutual support during the darkest months ahead. The reflection on our journey from the garage to the settlement revealed how much we had learned about survival, leadership, and human nature under extreme conditions. The skills that had seemed most important at the beginning, like mechanical knowledge and resource management, had indeed been critical, but equally important had been the ability to build trust, resolve conflicts, and maintain hope during periods when survival seemed impossible. Carlos's recovery became a symbol of what was possible when individual effort combined with community support and professional expertise. His transformation from a dying child in an abandoned truck stop to a healthy, curious 8-year-old exploring his new home demonstrated that the Ice Age, despite all its destruction, had not destroyed the human capacity for healing and growth. The garage that had been our fortress for 45 days now seemed like ancient history, a necessary stage in our evolution from individual survivors to community members. The modifications I had made to create heat, security, and storage had kept us alive long enough to develop the relationships and skills that made our eventual rescue possible. But the garage had always been a temporary solution, a place to learn and prepare rather than a permanent home. Looking forward from day 90 of the Ice Age apocalypse, I could see that our real work was just beginning. The immediate crisis of survival had been replaced by the longer-term challenge of rebuilding civilization in a world permanently changed by volcanic winter. The network of settlements represented the early stages of that rebuilding, but much more would be required to create sustainable communities that could thrive rather than just survive. The story I have told you covers just the first 90 days of what will probably be a multi-year crisis. Those 3 months taught me that survival is not about being the strongest or the smartest or the most prepared. Survival is about adapting to changing conditions, helping others when possible, and never giving up hope even when everything seems lost. It is about making difficult decisions quickly, learning from mistakes without dwelling on them, and building relationships that can sustain you through challenges that no individual can face alone. The Ice Age destroyed the world we knew, but it also created opportunities to build something better if we have the courage and wisdom to seize them. The settlements that are emerging from the ruins of industrial civilization represent a different way of organizing human society, one based on cooperation, sustainability, and mutual aid rather than competition and consumption. Whether this new world will be better than what we lost depends on the choices we make during the recovery process. If you are listening to this story, that means you survived the initial crisis and made it through the first phase of the collapse. That means you have the skills, knowledge, and determination needed to be part of building whatever comes next. The Ice Age is not over, and many challenges remain ahead of us. But we have proven that human beings can adapt to almost anything if we work together and refuse to surrender to despair. The most important lesson from those first 90 days is that survival is not an individual achievement, but a collective responsibility. We survive by helping others survive, by sharing resources and knowledge, and by maintaining hope even when circumstances seem hopeless. The garage where this story began was important because it kept me alive long enough to find the people who would share the journey with me. But the settlement where this story ends is important because it represents the foundation for a future that includes not just survival, but the possibility of prosperity and happiness for generations to come.